met Duncan Williams about 20 years ago, I think. He was a graduate student at Harvard, and he came down to do some teaching assistant work. And he was so good at it that we hired him to teach his own course, which is pretty unusual for graduate students. And he got about 80 students, and then didn't give them a TA. So we totally, in a typical Brown tradition in the humanities, completely exploited him. But he has kindly consented to return to the site of his exploitation. Duncan's mom is Japanese and his dad is British. He grew up in Japan and in England, and he came to the States to go to Reed College, one of the most progressive undergraduate institutions in North America. He also then explored the rest of the country by getting on what we call the magic bus.
The green tortoise.
Which was like $10, and you could go all over the country. That wasn't $10, but and it took you all the way across. So he ended up probably for the first time coming to the East Coast at that point. He did his PhD at Harvard, finishing in the year 2000, and took up positions at Berkeley, where he held the Ito Chair in Japanese Studies. And then he moved to University of Southern California a few years later, where he is the Shinjo Ito Distinguished Chair of Japanese Buddhism. And he is the head of the USC Center for Japanese Religion and Culture. He has published one book, and he has edited 5 others. His book is The Other Side of Zen, A History of Soto Zen, and he's one of the rare academics who is also not only engaged in practice, but he is an ordained Soto Zen priest, and he has not been shy about it, which is really great, and very unusual in that. He's currently working on a monograph, which is the subject of today's talk, Camp Dharma, Buddhism in the Japanese-American Incarceration Experience during World War II. He's working on several other books, and he recently, at University of Southern California, hosted the Japanese Prime Minister. There's actually a picture of Duncan online with the Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. So, without keeping you any longer, please join me in welcoming Professor Duncan.
Well, thank you all for coming out to a very delayed start of this lecture, and I'm always happy to see Professor Roth, and it was certainly a great experience some years ago to, I always do say, recently I've been chair of the department and center director for the last, I guess, 8 years now, and so I rarely get to teach courses, and I'll teach once in a while a graduate course. But my best, still to date, undergraduate teaching experience was here at Brown University. So very nice to come back. And what I want to do today is give a little bit of a sense of what my forthcoming book is about. And I'll try to breeze through the formal presentation a little bit just because of time, and invite you to ask questions and so forth. Now, I got into this just around the time when I was doing some teaching here at Brown, and I was still a graduate student, and it's been a project that's therefore been on my mind for a long time. And my mentor at Harvard was somebody called Professor Masayoshi Naratomi. And Professor Naratomi passed away during my time as a graduate student. And so this project began when his wife asked me to go through his office at 2 Divinity Avenue at Harvard, and kind of this, he had his own kind of organizing method, I suppose, but like it was just a mess of like piles of papers and graduate dissertation and things in Pali, things in Japanese, and I had to sort it all. And amongst the things I found was something that had the name Naratomi on it. But it looked a little bit different than his normal handwriting, which I used to, as his TA, have to kind of take his Japanese notes and then make them into English. And so I started reading this kind of little bit different Nakatomi writing, and it turned out that they were from World War II, written by his father, Nakatomi Shinjo. And he had left a series of sermons or Dharma talks that he gave during the war years in this camp called Manzanar, one of the 10 rather well-known camp run by the War Relocation Authority. I think most of you know that during World War II, about 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were incarcerated from the west coast of the United States, and another 150,000 Japanese in Hawaii lived under martial law. But that amongst these camps, one of the biggest ones, about 10,000 people were incarcerated in this camp called Manzanar in the eastern part of California. And so, and during the war, Professor Nakatomi's father was one of the few, only 2 Buddhist priests were serving this population, about 10,000 people in Manzanar. And he had left his Dharma talks, he had left a diary chronicling his life at camp. And Mrs. Nakatomi asked me to translate parts of it for her and the rest of the family. And so I started doing that kind of thing for a little while. This famous, so Ansel Adams, a famous photographer, took this photo of a monument inside Manzanar. And just as a little side note, the words on the Ireto means like a monument for the remembrance of those spirits of the ancestors who passed. And that was written by Professor Nakatomi's father. And it's a very iconic thing that is at Manzanar today. And in fact, he was the person who went around in the spring of 1943, collecting 10 cents per family to buy the concrete necessary to build this monument. And so if you go to Manzanar today, you'll still see that, and this kind of trace of Reverend Shinjo Nakatomi, who after the war became a very well-known priest in Gardena, California. But you know, it actually took Mrs. Nakatomi, my professor's wife, to convince me that it's worth dedicating, because I had no training in Japanese American studies or Asian American history or World War II history and so forth, to kind of investigate this further. After she told me her experience of World War II. She was only 11 years old at the time, living in a place called Madera, California. It's in the Central Valley. A lot of Japanese Americans did farming in that part of California. And in their little town, they had a Buddhist temple, called the Madera Buddhist Temple. And her dad he wasn't a priest or anything, but he was the president of the board. So most of these temples had boards, and he was the president. And so the family experienced a very interesting situation about 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. She came back, the 11-year-old girl, Miss Nato, came back from school, and she sees through the window into the living room, her mom sitting at the living room table with a shotgun to her head, and she sees her dad being beaten by some men in suits. And she realizes that probably, her parents from Wakayama Prefecture, they're immigrants, they don't speak almost any English. And probably these men in suits are not speaking in Japanese. So she's like, even though it's a very frightening thing to see, she begins to translate between the adults in this living room. And what it turns out was that they were FBI agents who had come to investigate her father because of his association with the Buddhist temple. At that time, the FBI had a kind of grab list, as it were, like a list of people that they needed to that they viewed as potential threats to national security. And it was called the ABC list for short. A being Japanese and Japanese Americans who were deemed the highest risk to national security. people on the B list were people to be interrogated and not necessarily picked up right away, arrested right away, but interrogated. And that's what Mr. Nagao's father was in the B list. Because most people who are on the A list, even on the day of somebody, the day of Pearl Harbor, they were picked up. And people on the C list were to be monitored. And so they had come to ask him questions, interrogate. And he had been out in the lettuce fields with a shotgun, apparently like this rabbits or something. So somehow they arrived at this moment where they thought maybe he was like gonna be resisting their coming to the farm. And so that's why there was a struggle, and that's why it was a very tense moment. And in any case, the FBI agent is saying, we're going to come back next week and to do further questioning and basically continue to monitor him. He's not a necessarily dangerous person, but he was supposed to be under surveillance. And so her father said, we need to, at times like this, the daughter's an American citizen, and they've been there for years, and they've been working hard to build up this farm. We need to show our commitment as maybe, the United States is now at war with Japan, but we want to show our loyalty and commitment to the United States. And so he had his daughter, this lady, Miss Nagato, build a little fire by the ofuro, or the Japanese bath. And that was one of her chores, so she didn't think too much of it until he brought everything in the house that had made in Japan or Japanese, kanji or Chinese characters on them. And then, for her, most devastatingly, he brought the entire, in Japan, Japanese people, they have a thing called Girls' Day, and there's a doll set called Hinamatsuri Ningyo that girls get at that time. So he brought her all her dolls and made her burn them. But then he brought something else, and he couldn't get himself to put it in the fire. And he asked his wife to get a senbei, like a rice cracker, like box, and then he got the backhoe near the garage near a large tree, dug a hole, and buried this set of documents in this box that would protect them. And his daughter was a little bit upset because she was like, what could be more important than my dolls? And so, when she asked her dad, what did you bury? He replied that it was the family, like his grandfather had handed to him Amirakyo, a Kyoto Sutra, a copy that had been passed down generation to generation, and that he had also, as president of the Buddhist temple, maintained the records from the establishment of the temple all the way to the 1941, all the kind of minutes of the board meetings. And he's like, these are not personal documents for me to burn. And so that's why he had buried them. And to make a long story short, they as most Japanese Americans have to do, once they were called up after mid-February 1942, there's President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, and in the months that follow, in different stages, their family also was called to go to initially what's called an assembly center in Fresno, where the Kimura family, this is Nagatomi's maiden name, that family lived in a horse stall. And in Portland, and there's a livestock expo in LA, there's a place called Santa Anita racetracks. A lot of Japanese Americans initially, before they went to the big camps like Manzanar, were housed temporarily for some months in these a lot of them were like racetracks and that kind of livestock expositions and so forth. And so they did that. They had to sell their farm that they had worked their entire life for about 1/20th of the market value. And that wasn't uncommon farms or small businesses were sold at incredibly discounted. They had between a week and 10 days to do this, and all they could take was one suitcase per person, or what they could carry personally. And so they returned after the war back to Madera, California, and they're hoping to get their farm back. But unfortunately, the new owners demanded that they pay market price, which of course during the war they didn't, weren't able to earn money, and of course, and they had only gotten 1/20th of it, so they knew like they had lost their farm, and then they had relatives in LA, so they thought, okay, we have to start our new life there, but maybe we have, there's a possibility we have to get that box that with the Buddhist sutras and the temple records, we got to find it. Again, unfortunately, during the war, the new owner had torn down the garage and cut down all the large trees on the farm. And so even though he kind of knew where it was, the kind of X marked the spot kind of direction, he didn't know, he couldn't find it. So I start the book with that story because to me it's a very interesting, it's a fairly typical thing of Japanese American farmers losing farms, but also there's something very important about the fact that there are buried in the soil of California some Buddhist sutras and Buddhist Japanese American history, temple history, that are still there. And it occurred to me that it's an interesting story because it's about the fact that while we can't get at the physical history of Buddhism in America buried in the ground soil of California, it might be possible for us to ask. I interviewed about 120 people for this book, and different archives, but to recall the memories of people about Japanese American Buddhist history. And it's also was striking to me that for this family, they burnt away, everything that is character on it, like maybe they burnt away their Japaneseness, but they refused to burn away their Buddhist faith. And so, in a way, the book is about that. It's the story of people who often faced this idea that America is a Christian nation. To be a true American, you need to be assimilated into, in some sense, Anglo-Protestantism, right? Because other groups have faced this kind of thing too. But for this family, they wanted to make an assertion that you can be both a loyal American, authentic American, and also a Buddhist. And so, in many ways, what I'm about to talk about is really about that question of is America a religiously free nation, a nation of religious freedom on the one hand, or is it to be understood as fundamentally a Christian nation? It's the kind of dynamic that families like the Kimura family often dealt with. Now, I mentioned at the very top that this all got started because of translating the diaries of Professor Nagatomi's father, Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi, at Manzanar. But he was one of the rare Buddhist priests who ended up at one of the big camps, like Manzanar. Most Buddhist priests were arrested right away, sometimes just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2, which is a military intelligence in the Army, and the FBI had coordinated these ABC lists, as I mentioned, and started arresting people right away. And so most Buddhist priests didn't end up at these big camps, but in this what the FBI called the most dangerous or most likely to be subversive category, as a class of person. Right? So while other individuals, both non-Japanese as well as Japanese, were on target lists. For example, German, because the United States is also at war with Germany and Italy, German nationals who had clear links to the Nazi Party, or Italians who were clear links to the Fascist Party, or Japanese consular officials. They're all on this A list. But and then they were put on there because of some very particular association as an individual. But as a category, this ABC list in the A list had Buddhist priests also, as well as Shinto priests, as a group lumped together as just a category of person that's dangerous, as a threat to national security. And so the vast majority of Buddhist priests ended up in camps run by the Department of Justice and the U.S. Army, including in this one is a diary. It's a 1,600-page Japanese diary that I translated about 800 pages of so far. But it's written by somebody who was in one of these army camps, Lordsburg, and then Department of Justice camp, Santa Fe. And Santa Fe Roosevelt Senji Tekikujin Yokuryujo Nikki was was a diary that somebody else associated with Professor Nagatomi, one of his students, Akira Tana, who's now a famous jazz musician in San Francisco area. His dad was a Buddhist priest, and he gave me this diary also to translate for his family. And what I found was that there were so many people who had families who had Buddhist priests who have sermons or diaries and other hitherto untranslated material from the World War II period. But what I found most interesting in one of the entries written by this man who was a Buddhist priest from Longpo Buddhist temples and also in California, was that by the time he got to summer of 1942, and maybe some of you may know, in Japanese Buddhism, one of the big kind of rituals that is held in the summer period is called obon, kind of ancestral memorial service or ritual, and that's very regionally variant in Japan, but had been a part of American Buddhist temple life as well among the Japanese American community. But he talks about an obon service being held in the middle of an American desert with 29 Buddhist priests and several hundred Japanese Buddhist laymen, surely a historical first. The saying Bukkyo Tozen, the eastward transmission of Buddhism, or advance of Buddhism, has never seemed as apt as it does today. And he uses this term Bukkyo Tozen, which first appears in Nihon Shoki, kind of 8th century chronicle, like classical texts, to talk about the eastward advance of the Dharma that was predicated on a prophecy that the Shakyamuni Buddha gave before his passed, that after his passing, that the Dharma would remain, and that Dharma would spread eastward. And back from as early, from early centuries, Japanese believed that what that meant was that from India to China, or through Korea, that Buddhism or the Dharma had finally reached Japan. But for that diarist, this Buddhist priest who was in a World War II internment camp, as well as for one of the early bishops, as they called them, of the Buddhist Mission of North America, which is the Jodo Shinshu Nishon Ranji lineage, headquarters of that lineage in North America, based in San Francisco, which Nakoyu once talked about as early as 1905, that their placement of the temple in San Francisco exemplifies the history of eastward transmission of Buddhist Bukkyo Tozen. And so, to me, that's a very interesting thing, that for many of these people who were Buddhists, in some sense, they understood their own incarceration as a prophecy of, like they were just fulfilling what had been prophesied. And in fact, these are photos of left one and the middle one of temples on sugar plantations in Hawaii. The first Japanese Americans set up their Buddhist temples on the plantations in the islands of Hawaii, Maui, and then later Oahu, and then Big Island. And then also the top one is a picture from Koyasan Buddhist Temple in Little Tokyo. It still is there, Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. But for many of these people, this idea of the eastward transmission or eastward movement of not only Buddhism but of people was a very common idea. And it contrasts with the notion of Christian, manifest destiny. So I rarely come out to the East Coast, but I often hear, in California, people, students at USC or when I was at Berkeley, like students talk about, like they say back east, right? Like as if and they may even be from like Washington State, but they still talk about like back east, meaning like the origins of America is somehow on the eastern coast of the United States, and that somehow these are newer kind of developments as we go to, pioneers and trailblazers in Oregon or something, or Hawaii. And so one interesting thing is that the backdrop to the World War II experience and why it is that Buddhist priests were put on this ABC list, whereas Japanese American Christian ministers were not, was that Buddhism was seen by not only intelligence agencies, that I mentioned, but also by other spheres of the US government as being heathen, foreign, and sometimes even un-American. And that this idea of to Americanize is to Christianize. I'm not going to read all these things, but there's certainly a long history of the idea that the United States is a territory that has been, in some sense, given God's mandate, a kind of manifest destiny to spread Christianity and civilization, often those two things being conflated. When I was at UC Berkeley, I once learned why the name of the town and the university is called that. And it was apparently because there's a thing called the Campanile, it's like a tower, where the Campanile stands today on that campus. The initial group of trustees that founded the University of California, at that time it wasn't called Berkeley yet, it was going to be called the University of California, said, one of them was standing on that hill, on that campus, and looked out to where today there would be the Golden Gate Bridge. It's called the Golden Gate, but there's no bridge yet. And that's where you can see the Pacific. And viewing the Pacific, apparently something triggered in his mind a poem by, in British, I guess they call George Berkeley, in American, pronounced Berkeley, but the Anglican philosopher and bishop and poet, who had written a poem called America, in which I can't remember the exact line, but there's something in there about the flow of civilization, running from east to west. And that triggered the mind of this person to say that as a new educational establishment in the westernmost part of the continent, that from England, to New England, and then onward to out west, this idea of civilization and higher learning, and also Christianization, was very much a part of the mental landscape of most people of that time. And so what happens is that you have a clash, or you have because for most Asian people coming to the United States, their journey is an eastward migration, right? And for most Latinos coming, it's a northern migration. But somehow in American history, it's somehow, there's only a unidirection. And so what is happening in the pre-war period is that different dialogues are happening about what constitutes Americanism and who belongs. And what became very clear by 1924 is that Asians don't belong. So there's a series, starting with the segregation of schools in San Francisco, and of course, even before that, the Chinese Exclusion Act. But by 1924, the Orientalist Exclusion Act, which is really a target towards the Japanese American population, there was a very clear interest in, on a national level, having immigration policy in which Asians would not only be not permitted to migrate anymore to the United States and that kind of exclusion, but also exclusion from the citizenry, right? By 22, there's the Ozawa case, famous Supreme Court case, in which it's made clear that even if you have, for example, fought for the United States in World War I, even if you had a very clear loyalty to the United States, if you were Asian, the Constitution did not permit, the Constitution talked about white and free black, persons as being eligible to naturalize. And so it became very clear that Asians were not to be understood as possible members of the American community. And so, and they had, Senator Phelan from California, they had these very strong associations of this, like why Asians can never assimilate, and this association that Asians who have this, many of them, this religion called Buddhism, are not only heathen in their belief, but also they believe in things that are un-American, and that are not possible to integrate. And so usually language has to do with the heathen religion of the Asians, and also the threat, the yellow peril, as well, the threat of the virility of Orientals, as the terms they used in that period, especially vis-a-vis intermarriage with whites. And that was a big kind of segregation, and intermarriage was a big aspect of how the rhetoric of exclusion happened in the earlier period. I'm not going to, just because of time, I'm not going to go into all the different things about other ways in which, maybe I'll just mention this just because it's a Supreme Court case, 1927. It's the first time that Buddhists took their claim that you can be both. I started this talk with this idea that you can be both American and Buddhist at the same time. In Hawaii, as well as in California and Oregon, there were state legislatures that were trying to shut down Japanese language schools in the 20s. Most of them run by Buddhist temples. So this idea of like Buddhist temples and this foreign language were seen as a kind of threat, and the terms that were used in that period, 1919, 1920, Hawaii Board of Mission, which is the main kind of Christian missionary board in Hawaii, used to use words like the retardation of Americanism that was constituted by the Japanese language schools at the Buddhist temples. They also used the word the repaganization of the islands. And by that they meant that, native Hawaiian peoples had, from Kamehameha and that dynasty and Kalakua and others, the kingdom had kind of mass converted to Christianity, and that they had secured, therefore, the Americanization of that territory. And by the time of the Organic Act and the incorporation into Hawaii into territory of the United States, that it had become a Christian territory. And then suddenly, by the 1920s, the largest ethnic group in Hawaii are Japanese, and the vast majority, over 90%, are Buddhist. And so they call that the repaganization of the islands. especially when the second generation refused or did not convert to Christianity. They saw that as a terrible threat to the integrity of their notion of America. And so the Buddhists, after the bill, the Clark Bill, Andrews Bill, the different laws that went into play that try to shut these Buddhist Japanese language schools down, they went to court, and through the Hawaii Territorial Courts, and then the Ninth Circuit, and then all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They took this case that said the territorial legislature has no business shutting down the free association of people, so that they can learn some Japanese, so they can the young people communicate with the parents. And so ultimately, the Supreme Court sides with the litigants, and those laws are struck down. And so it's the first time that on the federal level, at the national level, there's a clear affirmation of religious liberty and religious freedom. That just because you're Buddhist, or just because you're Buddhist and speak Japanese, doesn't mean that you're un-American. But of course, so that was 1927, while there are things in the decades prior to the war that look hopeful for American Buddhists, certainly by the first day or two of Pearl Harbor, after Pearl Harbor, it becomes very clear, religion matters. If you're Christian and Japanese, you're not going to be picked up. If you're Shinto or Buddhist and Japanese, you are going to get picked up. And this is just some photos. This one here on the right, I mentioned the Portland Livestock Expo. So again, kind of horse stalls for people who lived in the city of Portland, who were rounded up in the mass incarceration. And you can see, I think, there's an American flag, and if you look, it's a little bit hard to see, there's a little photo of the Buddha. And they, obviously this is about a month into their time in this camp, behind barbed wire in these horse stalls. And this family, it's the daughter of Reverend Terasawa Tansai of the Portland Buddhist Temple. And their dad had been taken away in the initial sweep, but the rest of the family was in this horse stall. And clearly they try to make it livable, right? When they first went into these camps, they were just told, here's your unit. There's no bedding, there's nothing. And there was some hay, and they would just say you have to make some kind of bedding out of that. So often they would try to use spare wood or do something to kind of make beds or make clothes or do other things, kind of, again, because they could only carry one suitcase or what they could carry. This is also a period in the weeks after Pearl Harbor that Buddhist temples, again, this association of Buddhism with the enemy. One is, there's many temples, but there's just one in San Diego. San Diego Buddhist Temple was vandalized, as were many other temples by, I guess, people who were upset at the Pearl Harbor attack. And especially temples that had the manji, this, kind of looks like a swastika, but it's of course a Buddhist symbol that predates the swastika by millennia. It's an ancient Buddhist symbol that is often used by Japanese Buddhists to designate the location of a Buddhist temple. Seattle took it down. Seattle Temple took down their manji right away. But temples that didn't, such as in Fresno or Vacaville, and other places, they were arson cases that were people that, especially for that thing, took their shotguns to kind of shoot at it. And one Buddhist recently died because of one of those type of attacks. So it's kind of like after 9/11, people mistakenly shooting up a Sikh temple. Sikhs have nothing to do with, Osama bin Laden. They're not even Muslim. But is that kind of like confusion in the aftermath of kind of war hysteria? But so, as I mentioned, there's 9066 that happens in February '42. and between Pearl Harbor and that period, that's when the selective incarceration happens, and then the mass incarceration happens thereafter. Amongst the selective incarceration, one of the least known camps is Sand Island, Hawaii, but is in fact one of the most active high security camps there exists. It's kind of like Guantanamo. It was where the first prisoners of war, captured prisoners of war, were placed, but also almost, I would say, 80% of the people that went to Sand Island were Buddhist and Shinto priests on the island of Hawaii. They were picked up, as I mentioned, on the first day of Pearl Harbor. And so there's quite a few Buddhist priests, including the Nichiren bishop, as well as the Jodo sect bishop, as they were called. The heads of those two Buddhist orders, because Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday, they were preaching and doing other activity at the temple, and they were grabbed. Unlike the mass incarceration, they had a week to sell their stuff or get their. They were just picked up, and so for the next several months, one diary I translated of one of these bishops talks about how he feels really bad that his robes, because he was picked up in his robes, are getting all tattered because they initially were in these little. That was what they had, and then they would be forced to actually build their own prison or kind of like build permanent structures that would house the inmates, and obviously they got dirty, and so a number of these Buddhist priests, that's the only clothes they had were their robes, as they built their own incarceration center in Sand Islands. It's an island right off. If you go to Honolulu today, it's still there. And then there was another one called Uli in the Gulch that was also used to hold Japanese Americans that were picked up in Hawaii. I'm not going to read it. This is just another letter by the Jodo bishop talking about how he feels like he's been, as Honen Shoin, one of the founder of the Jodo sect in Japan, had been exiled onto an island. He felt like he was exiled onto this island, and how his temple had now become occupied by the U.S. military. A lot of Hawaii temples under martial law, they basically requisitioned all of these Buddhist temples that no longer had the priests as military installations during the war. This is, I'm sorry, it's not, in fact, easy to see, or actually can't see it at all. But it's a thing by Fujimura Bunyu, Buddhist priest of Salinas, California, Salinas Buddhist Temple. And it illustrates the kind of hysteria of that period in which, and this, I haven't been following this, but I have to quote. This is a part of a diary in which he talks about what happened on December 8, 1941, arrived at Pearl Harbor. Quote, the Salinas chief of police came and ordered me to take down our temple gong. He said that the people of Salinas were frightened that if the Japanese Imperial Navy sailed into Monterey Bay, our gong could be used to signal them. He said that if we did not take our gong down, he would burn the tower containing it. The sound of our temple bell could hardly be heard upwind in the city, and only a few miles downwind. How ridiculous to think that its sound could be heard in Monterey, 19 miles away. So, but that was the kind of, atmosphere in which local law enforcement viewed Buddhism as some kind of major threat. The same chief of police would later use the head of the Salinas Christian Church, the Japanese head of that, as his primary informant during the weeks after that day, December 8th, that he went to take down Temple Gong, which did get taken down. So somehow there was some understanding in these communities that the Japanese that had converted to Christianity were more reliable or more loyal, likely to be loyal to the United States in case of a war with Japan. I mentioned Manchu already, and this is just like a chronicle. One of the things I was trying to figure out in my studies about all of this was, when was it that Buddhist priests got onto these lists of military intelligence agencies or the FBI? And you can see from as far back as 1918, MID, which is the Army, not the Naval Intelligence, Army's military intelligence talks about 3 sources of event in one of their classified reports. I declassified about 4,000 documents at the National Archives, and one of them talks about the Japanese government, Japanese language schools, of Buddhists as the 3 main sources of anti-Americanism. Office of Naval Intelligence. This is one of the reasons why Roosevelt becomes very easily convinced by other people in his administration, and of course, especially Western Command Zone, General DeWitt, later, about why they need to do the mass incarceration, is that he was a member of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and especially the Navy. They really feared Japan and Japan's Navy as a threat to national security. And in one of these Office of Naval Intelligence reports, it says Buddhist priests in Hawaii, while ostensibly loyal to the United States, are in reality doing everything in their power to undermine any American allegiance entertained by the Japanese in Hawaii. And it goes on. And by the 30s, these things are already very set, and they start getting these grab lists together. And so, as I mentioned, the euphemism used at that time for the mass incarceration were, they're called relocation centers. The horse stables or whatever were called assembly centers. And then these high security camps were Justice Department. It's actually not quite right. Some of them were justice and some of them were Army run. But so some of them were run by civilians, some of them by the military. But as you can see, they're dotted all over the place. I was just in New York City, and on Sunday, the premiere of this I don't know if you are, George Takei's new musical, the Star Trek guy's new musical. He's a feature. It's called Allegiance Open on Sunday. But I was once with him in Rower, Arkansas. Today it's just cotton fields. They built these things in very isolated desert, or in the case of Arkansas, swampy places. And he grew up there in Rower. And also, well, actually, you all know Mark Luno's father, Taika Tsuno, was also there with me, and his wife Alice. They grew up. Alice was in Jerome, and Ty was in Rower. And today there's only a small cemetery there, and we actually did a Buddhist service with George Takei, of all things. But the isolation of these places is quite striking. Now I want to move into kind of the latter half of what I want to say, which is that despite this isolation, despite having only a suitcase that they could take and so forth, Buddhist life in camps actually blossomed. And it's mainly because, if you can imagine, and that's why the sermons of Professor Nagatomi's father or these other ones are so interesting, because it's precisely when they've lost everything. Everything worked for their farms, a business model, whatever it is, and they had to kind of look to their faith and their faith. And most histories of Japanese American history, World War II history or Asian American history, doesn't really focus on the aspect of faith life. But for most people, that was a really important thing to help them orient themselves in incarceration behind barbed wire. On the left, you see a ojuzu, or a Buddhist kind of rosary, as it were, made by a Soto Zen priest in one of the camps. He was in one of the high security camps. And so in the high security camps, they had rules that basically followed the Geneva Convention for both POWs as well as civilians. So there's a part 2 of the Geneva Convention that deals with civilians. But so they have certain kind of rationing minimum, and one thing was 1 piece of fruit per week. And so he collected, because he didn't have his ojuzu, his Buddhist rosary, he collected the peach pits, one per week, and made this out of that. Or, you see this, I mean, to me it's a very beautiful Buddhist altar. But this is in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. One of the other 10, not the high security camps, but the general camps. And Reverend Shimakawa was one of the few people, other people who were in these type of camps. And it looks beautiful because the people that made it were the Nishida brothers. They, if you go to San Jose, the oldest Buddhist temple there is called San Jose Buddhist Temple. They were the carpenters and architects of that temple. They happened to be, most people in San Jose were taken to Wyoming, to Heart Mountain. And there, obviously they couldn't have carried this. And in fact what they did was they took desert wood, which is hard and not that easy to work with, and they used, so it's like little scraps, right, of that, plus in the mess halls where they would eat, a lot of the kind of food containers would come not in like, now it's like paper boxes and stuff. So they had these crates that would just be made of wood, and they would take those pieces of wood and they used that to make this large Buddhist altar to have in one of the barracks that got designated as the Heart Mountain Buddhist Temple. This is another one that Koyasan Buddhist Temple in LA is still there. Reverend Takashi Seiju is quite well known, a member of that Shingon Buddhist Temple, or well known even current member of his work. But he was in one of the high security prisons. And when you're in a high security prison, the searchlights come across your compound very frequently. And at least in the first 2 years, the kind of roll call, where they kind of basically do prisoner count numbers, was 6 times a day. So it's very disruptive in a certain way. And it's hard to sleep, they're constantly doing roll call, and these searchlights are going over. But look what he says. This is my this is not a good translation, but I return to the quiet and supreme life of walking alongside Kobo Daishi. As I try to practice meditation on the movement pine, I have been viewing the large searchlights as the Buddha's sacred light, and have been practicing meditation together with Kobo Daishi. So instead of seeing the lights as some kind of terrible obstacle to sleeping and so on, using the searchlights as a kind of aid to meditation. And so, and that's Reverend Naotomi, bottom there in Manzanar, and that's Aurora, Arkansas. You can see, you know, it says on that barrack, it says Aurora, Arkansas, and they're dressed up in their own, you know, they have one quite good suit for, and it's because it's a funeral. And if you look at the size of the coffin there, it's like a little kid, right? Small child's funeral in rural Arkansas. It's a Shingon group doing Goeka in Minidoka, which is where most Seattle people went. And Buddhist life in the you know, it continued. There were Buddhist weddings that people held, or these are funerals. That's the Manzanar barrack for the Manzanar. They called it Buddhist church. But if you look, you know, it looks like, so this is an adult, clearly, memorial, funeral. But you can see, like, this is fairly typically, besides the coffin, have flowers. But they're not flowers. This is in the middle of a desert. If you go to Manzanar, it's like, it's not flowers. They had the ladies, the Fujinkai Women's Association, one of the things they did was they took the packaging that stuff in the mess hall was brought into camp with. They would take that paper packaging, and basically it's almost like doing origami. Like they would make paper flowers try to have a semblance of normalcy inside these camps. Now I mentioned at the very beginning that Hideto, that Reverend Naotomi went around each barrack and asked for 10 cents per family to get the concrete. And it's because And that was the first 1943 for Bourbon. He wanted to have some kind of monument built by the summer of '43. And it's because so many, especially young people and elderly people, couldn't make it that first winter. A lot of, especially those two categories of people, the barracks were not yet well built, not insulated, it's very cold in the night, very hot in the day, and a lot of people died. And there's this idea of Nibon, the first Obon after somebody passes, how important it is to have some kind of celebration of their life. So one of the classified documents I declassified was there was basically a counterintelligence unit within these camps monitoring the Buddhists and what they're doing. And initially in the Daiburi camps, there's a program called the Americanization Program. And it was a program issued by government to try to get people to attend YMCA, YWCA, to go do Boy Scouts and like baseball and stuff like that, and not do like kendo and like Japanesey things. And so they initially did not want to have Buddhism be a part of camp life. But again, this is ongoing kind of struggle by Japanese American Buddhists to assert that America is a free country. And so, given that Roosevelt at that time, fighting the war in Europe, used to talk about the Nazis and the four freedoms of America, one of them was religious freedom. It was too much of a disjuncture to not permit Buddhists to practice their faith. And so Buddhists were ultimately compromised. Buddhists were allowed to practice and have a hut or a barrack to have a church, a Buddhist church. But Shintoists were absolutely banned in all of these camps. And Christianity was encouraged. So basically, Christianity is encouraged, Buddhism tolerated, Shinto was banned. And despite that kind of not encouraging view of the administration, Buddhists themselves turned out in this is 4,000 people. If you look at the date, it's 1943, August 15th. So the Obon dance of that year, that first year at camp, 4,000 people. And that's the document I declassified. They were the administration was super worried that the camp itself has maximum people population of 10,000 people. So 4,000 people turned up for a Buddhist, Mantar Buddhist Church hadn't run this Obon dance thing, and they were going to do something, service at the monument. And they thought that the prisoners were going to riot, basically. And so they were monitoring all of this very carefully. But all they were doing was dancing, doing Obon, in Nazareth. And so despite all of these type of constraints and suspicions about Buddhism as an anti-American religion, Buddhists signed up in record numbers and constituted the majority of those who went into military service during this period. There's an initial period of volunteerism and later a draft, but Japanese Americans at that time, if you might recall, the U.S. Army segregated all African American unit, and there was an all Japanese American unit out of Hawaii, the 100th Battalion, and then what was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team that merged, that fought in Europe as a segregated Japanese American unit. Started in Italy, broke through the Gothic Wall, saved the lost battalion, went through France, and then ultimately, in one of the most ironic things, the 442, this Japanese American unit is the first to reach Dachau concentration camp and liberate primarily Jewish as well as political prisoners from some of the sub-camps of that place. The irony being, that they had joined the U.S. military with siblings or parents in these camps behind barbed wire in the U.S. and they're liberating these camps in Germany. The 442 becomes the most decorated unit, not only in World War II history, but in all of U.S. military history. So in the press at that time, they were dubbed the Purple Heart Battalion just because of the sheer numbers of people that away fighting for the United States. I mentioned the Lost Battalion. One of the most famous fights is when several units are unable to rescue these 200-some Texans who are pinned down, and they're kind of lost in that sense, surrounded by Germans all around. They bring the 442 in and just basically they go on a suicide mission to get these 200-some Texans freed, and basically lose either KIA or about 800 members in that couple-day period to rescue 200 people. And the state of Texas gave honorary Texans or something like that, honorary Texans for these Japanese Americans who did that. But again, you see the artificial flowers, these Buddhist priests doing constantly these memorial services for all these Japanese American Buddhists who are American citizens who are fighting for the United States and are coming back dead. And these are all in camp needing to do memorial services and funerals for these young men. And the last thing I'm going to mention is this guy, Richard Sakakita. And I'm going to conclude with this one. He is interesting to me because he was the first Japanese American. Mom's very devout Buddhist person. Dad died when he was young. She had sent him to what was called a Coats School at that time. One of the Japanese American language schools I mentioned, run by the Nishonganji. They had to wear uniforms, so they called it the Coats School. So he was very proficient with Japanese, and his mother was very devoutly Buddhist, and he ends up being offered the first full scholarship to go to Kyoto to study at Nishonganji headquarters, at Temple and Ryukoku University, and then become the first American born they were hoping to come back and be a kind of missionary. So that's how much they thought on the Buddhist side that he was a very good student of Japanese and of Buddhism. But he declined that. He was also at McKinley High School, the head of the cadet unit, the ROTC, and Colonel McKinley, who ran the units in Honolulu, handpicked him and offered him a scholarship. He would have been the first Japanese American to have a full scholarship to go to West Point. He also turned that down. And then he actually started working in the pineapple fields. This is unusual, most people work on sugar plantations. So he but by the time 1940 came about, they approached him again. By they, I mean the Army G2, and it's called CIP first, and then CIC later, it's Counterintelligence Corps, and they recruited him to be basically a counterintelligence operative in the Philippines. And he's there when the Japanese attack Manila, ultimately go through Bataan, Corregidor, and then gets captured. One of the only two Japanese Americans to be captured by the Japanese in the Pacific. He then undergoes a 10-day period of torture by the Japanese military thought police, the Kempeitai, and basically they burn him, they beat him, etc. And during this torture period, later when he was interviewed, he often talked about two things that kept his spirits up. Number one, he said he would recall his teachers at the Buddhist language school, Japanese language school, and how upright they were, and that kind of stoic and upright character he would always try to recall as he was undergoing the torture. And then he said every day after the torture they would spread these, the Kempeitai would spread these like pebbles on the ground and then make him pick them up and order them, whatever. This is supposed to be spiritual cleansing so that he could be cleansed of his Yankee spirit. But he said actually what it did was it strengthened his American belief in the Yankee spirit, or the American spirit even more. And so in that most difficult, camps, difficult, but being tortured by the Japanese, really difficult situation, he comes to crystallize his identity as both an American but also a Buddhist. And the war, it's almost like a Hollywood movie. Like he's nearly killed by the Japanese, but ultimately he's able to engineer a prison escape. And he's in the jungle, and then the Japanese see him, and they shoot, and he gets shrapnel, he faints, he uses movies he saw, samurai movies he saw at the temple to recall, like they make these medicinal pastes out of grass or something, like he heal himself, but he's very weak, and then he gets captured by the Igorot tribe, which is a headhunting tribe. Anyway, there's all these different things that happen to him until one day he's in the middle of, the jungle, and an American patrol troop comes across him. And they think he's Japanese, and so they nearly shoot him, and then they take him into interrogation. So, and then General MacArthur learns that Sakakida is alive. He had been such an intelligence asset in the months prior to the war that MacArthur had sent 2 rescue operations to try to free him, both unsuccessful. And so when he learns that Sakakida is alive, he immediately brings him out. And instead of getting any R&R, he just put in charge. This is right when the war had ended. He gets found by this American patrol troop, and so he gets assigned to become the head of the Philippines Military Tribunal for war crimes. And in the course of doing that, he learns that the 3 Kempeitai, or Japanese military police officers who had tortured him, are on the list of people that he's supposed to investigate. And so he goes in with some sunglasses and pretends he can't speak any Japanese, and he goes into the interrogation room and asks them, did you know somebody called Richard Sakakida? He's not a Japanese, but a Japanese American. And they deny all knowledge. And then he takes, it's very dramatic, takes his glasses off, and he reveals who he is, and they get on the ground and prostrate before him, and they say, you can do whatever you want to us. And he said in that moment, he recalled the words from the Dhammapada about fire only being, adding fire to fire or anger to anger does not result in resolution, but it's only with the water of kindness that you can solve or resolve the tremendous anger he had towards these 3 Kempeitai officers. And ultimately, he ends up becoming, in the post-war period, quite a prominent military figure later in life. And he ends up working with the Japanese Self-Defense Force as a liaison and stuff like that. So, he forgave them in stuff, and drew on his Buddhism to do so. And is somebody who is clearly, an American and a Buddhist. And in the post-war, the incorporation of Buddhist chaplains, there's a campaign even that started during the war from inside the internment camps. These young, they call them YBA, Young Buddhist Association members, who wrote these letters to Congress and whatever to try to get a B designation on the dog tags for Buddhism, because up until that time, there was a C for Catholic, P for Protestant, and H for Hebrew, which meant Jewish, and then an X for everybody else. And they wanted a B. So then they got it. And in the post-war period, everyone from, Senator Daniel Inouye was in that battle, the Lost Battalion battle. That's why he lost one arm. You have Japanese Americans who end up in politics, especially in the state of Hawaii. Two state, United States senators, including current one, third one, Mazie Hirono, who's the first U.S. senator who's Buddhist. But you have a kind of confidence because of some of these efforts in military service and sacrifice there, that Japanese Americans who happen to be Buddhists do actually belong in America. And so I wanted to end there with, I'm sorry, it's a real quick sweep of some of the themes in the book. But the main one being, is it possible to be both an American and a Buddhist? And there's something very interesting, I think, to look at case of World War II and what these people went through to reflect on it. So thank you.
And do we have to be out of here by? No. Okay. So please feel free to ask questions. If you have some time.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if during that time, like late 30s, early 40s, and especially when a lot of Japanese people were starting to be put in internment camps, if there was also discrimination against like European Americans who were Buddhists. Like very obviously, probably very small population, but how people that were non-Asian Buddhists really did.
A great question. As you know, it's a very small group. There's a kind of difference between people out on the East Coast who were the scholars of American religious history, like Thomas Tweed, who writes about them as book Buddhists. So they were like involved in like temple life, or but they were either sympathetic to Buddhism and read lots of books about Buddhism but divorced from actual Buddhists from Asia, because just the East Coast didn't have a very large population, unlike California or Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii, of course. And so the convert, primarily, there's a few non-Caucasian people, but primarily white American converts to Buddhism who lived in those zones. In California, up in Washington State, there's a very well-known Buddhist priest called Sunya Prat, a woman who converted under Bishop Massimo, and actually used to run before the war the Tacoma Buddhist Temple right outside Seattle. And then Julius Goldwater, who used to run some things, the English language program at the LA, Los Angeles, Betsuin of Nichikonanji, or Ernest Hunt, who was in Hawaii in the headquarters of Honolulu Nishongaji Temple. There were certainly, I mean, I can almost name them all. Prosser, right? I can name them all. All the ones that ultimately not only were lay people interested in Buddhism, reading books and whatever, but went to temple, whatever, and also even went as far as ordaining to become Buddhist priests. Those people were terribly helpful, really helpful during World War II. Ernest Hunt in Hawaii single-handedly helped to protect both Jodo Shinshu, Sotoshu, like different temples. I mentioned a lot of them were taken over by the U.S. Army, as is, and a lot of them vandalized by soldiers, and the main altar and other things. And he would just go straight to later, different animals, but the leading military figure at that time, who was in charge, basically as a military governor of Hawaii, just go directly there and complain on behalf of Japanese American Buddhists about that. Julius Goldwater also did the same kind of thing in Los Angeles, storing things for people, make sure they weren't. And Sunya Prat and Julius Goldwater also went to many of these different camps. Gas, for the cars were rationed, and so they would make all kinds of sacrifices to get extra gas to make these long trips out to Mazatlan. None of them went out to Arkansas, but to Wyoming, etc., bringing them Buddhist texts, Buddhist ritual implements, things that they couldn't take with them. So to that extent, very critical. There were few in number, but I'm sorry I didn't even have time to talk about them too much, but the very, very important supporters of the Japanese American Buddhists during those days. So, and so, did they, and your question was, did they receive some kind of discrimination too? Initially, I saw a list, originally Patton created a list before he became a famous general. This is before the war. It was called the Orange List. And Code Orange was to refer to prisoner exchange lists if United States went to war with Japan. And basically, he had come up with a list, and it didn't actually get implemented. But it was a secret list of people to be picked up in the. It was kind of a precursor to the ABC list. People to be picked up in case of war with Japan, in case American consular officials and others were kind of like arrested or kind of, made prisoner by the Japanese at the outbreak of war. They were imagining they would need to basically round up a bunch of people too, so that they could be a prisoner exchange. And on that list was Ernest Hunt, this, white convert Buddhist priest in Honolulu. So that kind of anti-Buddhism, or seeing Buddhism as a kind of potential threat to national security, extended even to a non-Japanese person, but who had a Buddhist, affiliation. Yeah.
This is such a rich. There must be so much information to work with, but I feel like, this is very different from your work with Soto-zen. Did you find that you can use similar methods, or did you have to employ different methods?
So that's a great question. Yeah, so one, I mentioned I interviewed about 120 people for this, and some of them were in their 90s, and some of them passed away now. Doing work that is a little bit closer to the time period that we are living in allows, that kind of, the Soto-zen in early modern Japan kind of research, that there's nobody alive from that period that I can interview. So that's an additional kind of set of information. But in terms of kind of the method I used in that first book and how it might, inform what I'm doing now, I used to say, to get a multifaceted view of religious life in the past, we can't just use, for example, government documents. So during the, there's Jishabugyo and other kinds of government offices that had regulations on Buddhism and so on. That's one kind of point of view. The temples themselves left histories, left documents, left registers, left many kind of things that archival researchers have looked into. But the temples themselves have a kind of point of view that don't necessarily reflect what average people are experiencing when they go. So I often had this kind of triangulation strategy where I try to look at average people's diaries and records and sensibilities about what it meant to be Buddhist in early modern Japan. I would use Buddhist temple archives and then government documents, and I would triangulate between government, temple, average parishioner, and in some ways, I try to do this with this book too. I look at the National Archives, I look at government and military intelligence kind of reports and counterintelligence reports within the camp. That's one kind of point of view, the government point of view. And then I try to look at Buddhist priests and their diaries, letters, but sometimes for the average people, it's not the same intensity of faith and so on as a Buddhist priest. None of the regular lay people I studied or interviewed talked about Bukkyo Tozen and that kind of fulfilling a Buddhist prophecy. There's a different point of view. So in terms of writing it up, it's kind of like trying to interweave those three perspectives in a kind of balanced or sensible way. And I guess the other thing I really took from one of my advisors at Harvard at that time when I was writing the dissertation that became the first book on Soto-zen, this guy called Hal Blytho, he's passed away now, but he often used to tell me, good history writing is like making a chocolate chip cookie. And it's like, what are you talking about? But what he meant was that the chocolate chips were the kind of nuggets of data or anecdotes or kind of stories that were kind of interesting. And the dough, though, was the kind of narrative and the kind of framing devices that you would use to kind of set these things in. And too many chocolate, you would always complain about Japanese scholarship, it's like this late one chocolate chip after another. So it's fact, and then there's no analysis, there's no narrative, And but then he used to always complain about American scholars too theory driven and like they don't actually know facts and you know so here's like you know you got to kind of balance that. So I've always taken that type of writing thing to heart, and so what I was doing for that project and what I'm doing for this one is very similar in terms of trying to find that right balance between narrative and framing, and then having kind of little stories that somehow you know illustrate something. Yeah.
Well, this was really powerful stuff, Duncan. My question actually connects directly, I think, with what Adrian asked. When you're looking or have been looking at the materials related to what you call the ordinary people in this project, what's your criteria for determining that they're Buddhists at all? I mean, how do you have some kind of notion in mind there, and to what extent can you even say that they're not, say, Shinto, or just that they're not anything? How did you select those materials, whatever they may be? And what we heard most about today, it seems to me, were the clergy, that perspective,
Right.
and the government reports.
So I would say the vast majority of people I interviewed were not the Buddhist priests themselves, because they had most of them long passed away. So it often had to do with, I mentioned like Professor Nagatomi's father's diary led me to this guy, Akira Tano, sharing his father's diary. And the Japanese American community is like it's kind of small, like everybody knows everybody. And so, you know, I do something at San Jose Buddhist Temple and then Seattle Temple, and basically to get the non-priestly perspective, it's just interviewing and finding documents and letters and correspondence between different people in different camps, and especially the soldiers' stories are usually, you know, they're not Buddhist priests, they're just average Japanese, you know, second generation Japanese Americans, and what they were feeling as they, you know, signed up for military service and stuff like that. And so a lot of those stories were just almost like reference, like people would refer to me like, oh, Uncle so-and-so in, you know, Carmel Valley, you go there, he'll tell you some more story. You know, it's kind of like that. So there's a little bit of randomness to that kind of, you know, thing. But I feel I've done enough of it that I kind of know what repeated patterns tend to exist when it comes to, especially the people that were involved in the YBA. That was, of course, even pre-war organization. But during the camp period, the people that were in their late 70s and early 80s, as opposed to late 80s and early 90s, were people who were involved, whose names you can find in, you know, Heart Mountain had one, Manzanar, these kind of like, they loved doing mimeographed newsletters back then, and you can find all the names of like, this is the social chairperson for the YBA, and then there's most often a woman. And then the Buddhists also had baseball teams in the camps, and they used to call them the Busse, like Issei something, but they call themselves the Busse, and like, you know, you'd have these kind of results of like, the Manzanar Busse beat the blah 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 10-2 or something, and so basically I started collecting lists of people who were likely still alive that I could interview and get a sense of, they were just like 20-year-old kids or 19-year-old kids at that time, and they played on the YBA baseball team. They were in charge of like in Arkansas especially, because one of the military camps, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, was close by. The women, the YBA women, organized a lot of dances for the USO and try to cheer up the young men who are undergoing what do you call it? Basic training. And so there's they had these Buddhist dances in the camps and stuff like that. And I basically was able, again, through like, oh, Uncle so-so would probably know her. Like, I was able to track down a lot of people who were, again, not Buddhist priests, but just average like 19-year-old youngsters at that time, both women and men. And that was my method for trying to get as many stories from them as possible. Yeah.
Do you have a sense, or are there documents which indicate anything about the relative percentages of followers of the different schools of Buddhism, of Pure Land and Jodo Shinshu, as opposed to Shingon? And probably I would think Zen is in the minority, maybe more so to just kind of reflecting what's going on in Japan. I remember that Sokean Sasaki, who founded the first Zen Institute, was kind of a Zen missionary of sorts, one of the first over to America, was put into one of the camps.
Yeah, Heart Mountain.
Yeah. See, he was at Heart Mountain. And didn't he die in the camp?
No.
But right after he got out.
He got out. But yeah, vast majority, about 70% were Jodo Shinshu Pure Land of the Nishihonganji tradition. In Hawaii, they called it Honpa Honganji Okoi, and in the mainland, they called it Buddhist Mission of North America until the camp period, in which, again, to try to seem like they're more assimilated or more loyal to America, in 1944 in Topaz Camp, which is where Bishop Matsukage of the Buddhist Mission North America was located, because he was there, that was the headquarters, and they changed the name to BCA, Buddhist Churches of America. And but that was the biggest one. Second biggest one, Higashonganji. Then Shingon, then Jodo Shu, then Soto Shu. And there's some others too, but minority.